The desert had a way of swallowing sound before it swallowed men, and on that particular morning it swallowed both. At 5:47 hours, a convoy of American and Allied forces moved through a narrow valley in eastern terrain that mapmakers had labeled with grim understatement a high-risk corridor. The call came in broken, half-swallowed by static and gunfire, multiple contacts, taking fire from elevated position. "We are pinned." Repeat, "We are pinned." Command scrambled fast air support. What arrived on radar wasn't what anyone expected. Not a sleek fighter jet screaming in at Mach 2. Not the roar of a stealth bomber cutting silent through cloud cover. Instead, a slow, ugly, twin-engine aircraft with a nose like a blunt fist and a wingspan built for loitering, not glory, banked low over the ridgeline. Ground troops later swore they heard laughter over the radio when the call sign came through. "Hex inbound, ETA 90 seconds. A woman's voice, calm, almost bored. Somewhere in a command tent 40 miles back, a colonel who had flown F-16s his whole career muttered something about sending a tractor to do a sniper's job. Nobody corrected him. Nobody yet understood what they were watching descend through the haze, an A-10 Thunderbolt II, older than some of the men on the ground, flown by a pilot most of the squadron had written off the moment she'd been assigned. They didn't know her real name yet, they only knew the call sign stitched onto her flight suit, Hex. They didn't know that 12 years earlier, a young flight cadet had been told by an instructor that she'd never have the nerves for close air support. They didn't know she had graduated top of her class anyway, silent and unimpressed by their doubt. They didn't know the reason she flew a jet built in the 1970s instead of something newer, faster, shinier, because she had asked for it. Because she understood something about that aircraft that no one else in the squadron did. The pinned soldiers on the ridge didn't care about any of that. They cared about the mortar rounds walking closer to their position, about the machine gun nest chewing through the boulder they were using as cover, about the fact that help was 30 seconds out and 30 seconds felt like forever. Then the sky changed. A low, guttural growl rolled down through the canyon, not the shriek of a fighter, but something heavier, angrier, more deliberate. The A-10's twin turbofans howled as she dropped altitude in a tight, controlled spiral, wings rocking once, a signal, a promise. "Ground element, this is Hex, I have eyes on, danger close, keep your heads down." No one on that ridge doubted her again after what happened in the next 4 minutes. But right now, in this moment, frozen just before the storm, they didn't know that yet. They only knew the sky had gone quiet and something enormous was falling out of it. To understand why a war-worn warthog and the woman flying it had been sent to that valley instead of anything faster, you had to go back 6 weeks, to a briefing room that smelled of burnt coffee and skepticism. Major Adaline Cross walked in wearing a flight suit 2 sizes too practical for anyone's taste. Hair pulled back in a knot too tight to move, expression unreadable. She was 41 years old, which in fighter squadron terms made her something close to ancient. She had flown 3 tour. She had more logged combat hours than half the room combined. None of that mattered in the first 90 seconds, because the first 90 seconds were always about the whispers. "They're putting her on the Hog Squadron. She flew test aircraft for the last 4 years. She's basically a desk pilot with wings. Heard she asked for this assignment. Who asks to fly the ugliest plane in the inventory?" Cross heard every word. She always did. Pilots thought headsets and hallway acoustics kept secrets. They never did, not from someone who had spent a career learning to listen past engine noise for the sound of trouble. She didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only fed the room. Colonel Marsh, the squadron commander, a broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples and doubt etched permanently into the lines of his face, called the room to order. "This is Major Cross," he said, the way a man announces an unwelcome addition to a well-oiled machine. "She's transferring in from Edwards' test pilot background. She'll be flying Hog 2. A young captain, call sign match, leaned toward his neighbor and murmured something about affirmative action with an afterburner. It wasn't quiet enough. Cross's eyes flicked toward him for exactly 1 second, long enough to let him know she'd heard, not long enough to dignify it with a reaction. What none of them knew, what the personnel file conveniently omitted, was that Adaline Cross hadn't spent those 4 years at Edwards flying a desk. She'd spent them testing the very avionics upgrades now installed in the jets they flew, diving the A-10 into simulated engagements no one else in that room had survived on paper, let alone in the air. She had chosen the Warthog, not been assigned it. Chosen it deliberately the way a surgeon chooses a scalpel over a laser, because sometimes precision mattered more than speed, and because she understood something about staying low, staying slow, staying present with the men on the ground that fast movers never could. She also carried something heavier than any of them knew, a brother, a ridge line 11 years earlier, a call for air support that arrived 4 minutes too late from an aircraft too fast to loiter, too proud to circle back. She had not chosen the A-10 for glory. She had chosen it so that 4 minutes would never happen again. Her call sign hadn't come easy. In flight school, call signs were currency, and the currency was almost always mockery dressed up as tradition. The instructors let the squadron vote, the way squadrons always did, over cheap beer and cheaper jokes. Someone had proposed ice because she rarely smiled. Someone else cruelly had proposed desk, a jab at rumors she'd wash out and end up behind a monitor. It was a lieutenant named Dobbs, later killed in a training accident nobody talked about anymore, who had actually watched her fly. He'd seen her thread a canyon approach in a simulator that had grounded 3 other cadets with vertigo alone. He'd watched her calculate a gun-run angle in her head faster than the onboard computer, correcting for wind she'd clocked by watching dust drift off a distant ridge. Dobbs had turned to the room and said simply, "She's got 6 sides. You think you've got her figured, and there's always one more angle you didn't see." Hex, it stuck, not because it was flattering, nobody meant it as a compliment at first, but because it was accurate, and accuracy has a way of outlasting insult. Cross herself had never explained what the name came to mean to her privately. In her mind, a hexagon wasn't just a shape with 6 sides. It was the honeycomb, thousands of them locked together, small, unglamorous, individually unremarkable, until you saw what they built when they worked as one. She thought of formation flying that way. She thought of infantry squads that way. She thought most of all of her brother's unit that way, 16 men locked shoulder to shoulder on a ridge, waiting for support that came late. His name had been Weston, Corporal Weston Cross, 23 years old, 3 months from rotating home. She didn't talk about him. She carried a photograph of him in the left breast pocket of every flight suit she'd worn since his funeral, folded small, edges soft from repetition. The A-10 pilots who had flown that day, a different squadron, a different war, faster jets running low on fuel and unable to loiter, were not to blame, not really. Cross understood physics. She understood mission tempo, fuel windows, competing priorities stacked 5 deep on a single radio frequency. She did not hate them. But she had made a decision in the silence after his memorial service, starring at an honor guard folding a flag into a tight triangle, that she would spend the rest of her career becoming the kind of pilot who never had to explain, 4 minutes too late, why the sky had been empty when it mattered most. That was the story behind the call sign nobody bothered to ask about. That was the story about to save an entire platoon on a ridge they hadn't even reached yet. 6 weeks after that briefing room, the squadron deployed forward to a dust-blasted airstrip wedged between 2 mountain ranges, a place so remote that resupply flights sometimes arrived a full day late and nobody complained, because complaining changed nothing out here. Cross settled into the rhythm of forward operations, the way she settled in everything, quietly, methodically, without ceremony. She memorized the terrain from satellite imagery until she could sketch the valley system from memory. She spent hours with the ground liaison officers, absorbing call sign structures, unit positions, likely ambush corridors, the personalities of the radio operators she'd be talking to under fire. Most pilots skipped that last part. Cross never did. She believed a voice you recognized under stress was a voice you could trust faster, and trust, in close air support, was measured in seconds that meant lives. The mockery didn't stop entirely, but it thinned, diluted by proximity and shared exhaustion. Match, the young captain who'd made the joke in the briefing room, found himself paired with her on a training sortie designed to simulate a troops in contact scenario. He flew wing, she flew lead. What he saw changed something in him, though he wouldn't have admitted it aloud yet. She flew the valley low, terrifyingly low by his standards, using the terrain itself as cover the way infantry used to berm. She called out landmarks before he'd even spotted them. She adjusted her gun-run angle mid-dive to account for a crosswind he hadn't factored, and put simulated ordnance exactly where the exercise controller had marked the enemy position, close enough to the friendly marker that the controller radioed a warning before realizing, checking twice, that her spacing had been intentional, danger-close accurate, not reckless. "She flies like she's already been shot at for real," Match told his roommate that night, quieter than his usual bravado. "Like she's not guessing, like she already knows what the ground's gonna do." He didn't know about Weston. He didn't know about the ridge, the 4 minutes, the folded photograph. He only knew what he'd seen, competence so complete it made mockery feel foolish in retrospect, the way loud things always feel foolish next to something quiet and certain. Colonel Marsh watched the debrief tapes twice. He said nothing to Cross directly. But 2 days later, when the tasking order came down for a joint patrol requiring close air cover in the Valley Corridor known informally among the troops as the Throat, a place where 3 previous convoys had taken fire, he assigned Hogg 2. Cross, alone with her wingman, 30 miles from the nearest backup, over terrain that had already killed men on both sides. She read the tasking order twice the way she read everything twice and said only, "Copy, Hex is ready." Nobody in that ops tent yet understood how true those words were about to become. The morning of the mission arrived gray and still, the kind of stillness that soldiers learn to distrust more than storm. Cross ran her pre-flight checks with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, hands moving over switches and gauges with a familiarity that looked almost tender. Flaps, ordnance racks, the 30mm Gatling cannon nested beneath the nose like a held breath. Her wingman that day was a younger lieutenant, call sign Root, quiet, competent, still finding his rhythm. He'd heard the rumors about her but hadn't formed strong opinions either way. He was too new to the squadron to have inherited its prejudices fully. "First real op with you, ma'am," he said over the intercom as they taxied. "Any advice?" "Trust the jet," she said. "Trust the ground unit's eyes more than your instruments when the two disagree. And don't fly like you're trying to prove something. Fly like you're trying to bring everyone home." He didn't fully understand what she meant yet. He would by the end of the day. They lifted off into a colorless sky, engines settling into their familiar low growl, and turned toward the valley the maps called Sector 9 Delta and the infantry, with characteristic bluntness, called the Throat. Below them the terrain unspooled in ochre ridgelines and dry riverbeds, ancient and indifferent, having swallowed armies for 1,000 years before anyone had thought to name them. Radio traffic stayed light on the way in, routine check-ins, fuel state calls, a joke from Root about the coffee back at base that Cross allowed herself a small smile at, unseen behind her oxygen mask. It was the kind of quiet that combat veterans learned never to trust completely. At 5:30 the quiet broke. Any station, this is Titan 6-2. We are troops in contact. I say again, troops in contact, requesting immediate CAS. Grid follows." The voice was young, strained, trying so hard to sound calm that the effort itself betrayed the fear underneath. Cross recognized the cadence instantly, a lieutenant, probably his first real firefight, doing everything by the book because the book was the only thing holding the panic at bay. She keyed her mic, voice dropping into the register she used only in moments that mattered, low and level as still water. "Titan 6-2, this is Hex. I copy, troops in contact. Say your position, say enemy disposition, say danger close authorization." The reply came fast, words tumbling over each other. "We're pinned in a wash, elevated position north, maybe 80 meters, heavy machine gun and at least 1 RPG team. We have wounded. We cannot move." Cross was already banking the jet, Root sliding into formation behind her without needing to be told, both aircraft dropping altitude, engines howling louder as the valley walls rose up on either side like the jaws of something ancient finally closing. "Titan 6-2, she said. "Hang on, Hex is inbound, 90 seconds. 90 seconds, she had learned a long time ago on a ridge she never reached exactly how long 90 seconds could feel. She intended to make sure these men never had to wonder. The valley opened beneath them like a wound, dry riverbed cutting through rock the color of old rust, and Cross saw the fight before she fully processed it. Muzzle flashes strobing from an elevated outcrop, dust kicked skyward from impacts along a shallow depression where a dozen soldiers pressed themselves flat against stone that offered barely enough cover to matter. "Titan 6-2, Hex is overhead. I have your smoke," she said, spotting the thin violet plume the lieutenant had popped to mark his position. "Confirm enemy position relative to smoke." "Enemy is 50 meters north of smoke, elevated in the rocks. Jesus, there, we've got a man down. We need it now, we need it now." 50 meters, danger close didn't begin to describe it. Standard procedure called for a second confirmation, a 9-line brief read in full, a deliberate unhurried sequence designed to prevent exactly the kind of tragedy that haunted every CAS pilot's nightmares. Cross had exactly none of that luxury, and she knew it, and she made the call anyway because she had spent a career training for precisely this moment. "Titan 6-2, I need everyone's heads down. I say again, heads down, danger close, in from the south. Mark your position with an air panel if you have one. Panels out, just do it, we trust you." 3 words that would echo through the rest of her career. We trust you, from strangers, from men who had no idea who was flying above them, who had inherited the same skepticism the rest of the squadron carried, dissolved instantly under the simple physics of desperation. When you are dying, you stop caring what the pilot looks like. Cross rolled the Warthog into a steep bank, lining up the gun run with a calm that belied the stakes, Root peeling off to provide overwatch and mark the enemy position with a rocket if she needed correction. She dropped altitude, airspeed bleeding to the aircraft's sweet spot, the world narrowing to a tunnel of rock, dust, and the small violet smudge of smoke 50 meters from human beings whose lives now depended on math she'd done 1,000 times in simulators, and exactly twice for real. Guns, guns, guns. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon beneath the nose erupted, a sound like the sky itself tearing 30mm rounds walking across the rocky outcrop in a line so precise it looked, from the ground, like judgment made visible. The outcrop dissolved into a cloud of shattered stone and flame. Silence followed, the specific ringing silence that comes after violence this total. Then the radio crackled back to life, the lieutenant's voice cracking with something that wasn't fear anymore. Splash, splash, good hits, target destroyed, I say again, target destroyed, Hex, that was incredible. Cross said nothing for a moment, banking the jet back around, scanning for secondary threats. Then, quiet, copy, Titan 6-2, check your wounded, Hex is staying on station. Below her, men who had been prepared to die were instead, impossibly, still breathing. The valley wasn't finished with them yet. As Cross circled back for a battle damage assessment pass, Root's voice cut in, tighter than before. Hex, I've got movement, second position, West Ridge, looks like they're repositioning a heavier weapon, could be a DSHK, hold on. A heavy machine gun, something that could reach out and touch an aircraft at altitudes a rifle couldn't. Cross's eyes tracked the ridge, catching the telltale glint of metal being dragged into position. And beneath it, worse, she saw the pinned soldiers beginning to move, medics dragging their wounded man toward what they thought was cover, exposing themselves to the new position without knowing it existed yet. Titan 6-2, hold your position, do not move, repeat, do not move, new threat West Ridge. Copy, wait, we can't stay here, we're exposed if that gun opens up. You're more exposed moving, trust me, Hex has it. There it was again, that word, trust. Cross had spent a career being told, implicitly and explicitly, that she hadn't earned it yet, that her flight hours were somehow less real than the men who'd never questioned their place in a cockpit. Here, 50 meters above men who were one wrong decision from dying, trust wasn't a debate, it was oxygen. She rolled the aircraft toward the new threat, Root falling into a covering position behind her, and toggled to her Maverick missile system, walking through the targeting sequence with the same unhurried precision she'd applied to everything since flight school. The precision that had once been mocked as coldness, now revealing itself as the only thing standing between a dozen men and a very bad day. Titan 6-2, Hex is engaging West Ridge, keep heads down. The missile left the rail with a violent shudder through the airframe, trailing smoke in a long white signature across the gray sky, and found the heavy weapon position in under 6 seconds, an explosion that rattled loose rock down the ridge face in a slow-motion avalanche, silencing the DSHK crew before they'd fired a single round. For a moment the valley held its breath. Then the lieutenant's voice came back, and this time there was no fear in it at all, only something rower, something like awe. Hex, this is Titan 6-2. We've got no more contact, no more contact. You saved my whole element, all of them. Cross banked the aircraft in a slow, wide arc above the valley, watching medics finally move freely across open ground toward the wounded man, watching soldiers rise from cover they'd believed might be their last position on Earth. Copy, Titan 6-2, she said. Get your wounded to the LZ. Hex will stay on station until the birds arrive. Root's voice came over the private channel, quieter, almost reverent. Ma'am, that was the best CAS run I've ever seen. She didn't answer right away. She was looking at the folded photograph tucked in her breast pocket, invisible beneath layers of flight suit and armor, and thinking of a Ridge 11 years gone. Just doing the job, she said finally. Let's get these men home. The medevac helicopter arrived 11 minutes later, a Black Hawk skimming low through the valley with the careful urgency of a bird landing near something wounded, and Cross watched from altitude as the ground team loaded their casualty, a young private, still alive, still breathing, because a gun run 50 meters from his own position had been threaded with a precision that left no room for error. She stayed on station until the helicopter cleared the valley, until Titan 62's voice came over the net one final time, no longer strained, no longer desperate, steady, almost boyish with relief. Hex, this is Titan 62, all personnel accounted for, one wounded, stable, evac inbound to field hospital. We wanted to say thank you, all of us. Copy that, Titan 62, Cross said. Glad you're all headed home, Hex RTB. She turned the aircraft back toward base, Root falling into formation beside her, and for the first time since the mission began allowed herself to exhale fully, the tension she'd carried in her shoulders for the better part of an hour finally loosening. The valley fell away behind them, rust-colored and quiet again, holding its secrets the way it always had. Neither pilot spoke for several minutes. There wasn't much that needed saying. The silence between them had changed character somewhere over the last hour, no longer the silence of skepticism, but something closer to reverence, the particular quiet that settles over people who have witnessed something they know they'll remember for the rest of their lives. Back at the airstrip, the debrief was unusually short. Colonel Marsh reviewed the gun camera footage twice, the same way he'd watched the training tapes weeks earlier, and this time he didn't stay silent. That danger close run, he said, studying the frozen frame of the impact 50 meters from friendly positions. By the book, you'd have waited for a second confirmation. You didn't have time. No, sir. You'd have been within your rights to hold fire and wait for updated coordinates. They'd have been overrun by the time I got them, sir. Marsh studied her for a long moment, the same man who, 6 weeks earlier, had introduced her to the squadron, the way one introduces an unwelcome complication. Something in his expression had shifted, some calculus recalibrating in real time. That was the finest CAS run I've reviewed in 15 years of command, he said finally. I don't say that lightly. Cross allowed herself the smallest nod. She had learned not to need the validation, but she wasn't foolish enough to pretend it didn't matter. Recognition, when it finally came, tasted different than she'd expected, a quieter, less triumphant, more like a held breath finally released. Word moved through the base the way it always did in forward operations, fast, embellished slightly with each retelling, until Hex wasn't a name whispered with mockery anymore, but one spoken with something closer to reverence. Soldiers she'd never met began nodding to her in the chow line. Pilots who'd laughed at her assignment weeks earlier now found reasons to ask about her gun run technique. She noticed, she said little. The photograph in her breast pocket stayed exactly where it had always been. Not every mission ended in triumph, and the war made sure Cross remembered that lesson before it let her feel too settled in her new reputation. 3 weeks after the Valley engagement, a different call came in, this one at night. The worst conditions for close air support, when altitude and shadow conspired to erase the careful margins pilots relied on in daylight. The joint patrol had walked into an ambush along a supply route, this time facing not just small arms but a pickup truck mounted with a heavy weapon, and worse, intelligence suggesting possible enemy armor moving to reinforce. Cross scrambled with Root again, night vision equipment casting the world in grainy green, the valley below rendered alien and flat, depth perception reduced to guesswork and instrument trust. The radio traffic this time carried a different texture, not panic exactly, but the grim professionalism of men who had done this before and knew exactly how badly it could go. Hex, this is Anvil 3-1. We have a technical mobile, moving fast, requesting immediate strike, coordinates to follow. She acquired the target through her targeting pod, the thermal signature of the vehicle glowing hot against the cool desert night, and made the call with the same steadiness that had defined every mission since, but this run went differently. As she rolled in, a burst of tracer fire arced up from a position she hadn't clocked, close enough that Root's voice cracked over the radio. Hex, taking fire, are you hit? For a half-second that felt like an hour, the aircraft shuddered. Not a hit, she realized, gauges scrolling clean, but proximity close enough to rattle the airframe and her nerves both. She'd flown through worse in training. She hadn't expected the sudden, visceral memory that surfaced anyway. Her brother's unit, a night much like this one, a call for support that never came in time. She didn't freeze. That was the thing about training deep enough, it held even when memory threatened to overwhelm it. She completed the run, destroyed the technical, and only allowed herself to feel the fear afterward, hands trembling slightly against the control stick as she climbed away from the valley floor. Hex, you good? Root asked. I'm good, she said, and mostly meant it. Back at base, alone in her quarters that night, she allowed herself something she rarely permitted. She took out the photograph, studied her brother's young, unweathered face, and spoke to him the way she sometimes did in the quiet hours, half prayer, half confession. "I got them home tonight," she whispered. "I got all of them home." It wasn't absolution. She didn't believe in absolution, not really, not for something that had never been her fault to begin with. But it was something adjacent to peace, and after 11 years, she had learned to accept peace in whatever imperfect shape it arrived. The war continued, the missions continued. And slowly, mission by mission, the name Hex accumulated a different kind of weight across the squadron, not mockery, not novelty, but something the infantry understood instinctively and the fighter pilots were only beginning to learn. Trust once earned in fire does not need to be re-earned. The technical strike marked a turning point that even the most stubborn skeptics in the squadron couldn't ignore, but reputation in a war zone was a strange currency, earned in minutes, spent in seconds, and requiring constant renewal against an enemy that never stopped adapting. Intelligence reports began flagging a pattern. The same insurgent commander responsible for the Valley ambush, a man the intercepted communications referred to only by a nom de guerre translating roughly to the shepherd, had begun specifically targeting convoys along Sector 9 Delta with increasing sophistication, better positioned ambushes, coordinated timing, weapons caches pre-positioned along likely American movement corridors. Command believed he was building toward something larger, a coordinated strike meant to inflict maximum casualties and maximum humiliation in a single, spectacular engagement. Cross studied the intelligence briefs the way she studied everything methodically, looking for patterns others missed. She noticed something the analysts hadn't fully articulated. The ambush sites all shared a specific terrain signature, elevated positions with 2 viable retreat routes, chosen by someone who understood not just infantry tactics but air support limitations. Someone who had studied how American CAS aircraft typically approached, typically banked, typically loitered. "He's been watching our patterns," she told Marsh during a planning session, pointing to the overlay map. "Every strike site gives his fighters a route to break contact before air support can reposition for a second run. That's not luck, that's study." Marsh frowned at the map, then at her. "You think he's specifically countering CAS doctrine?" "I think he's specifically countering fast movers," she said. "Everything about these positions assumes an aircraft with a 5-minute loiter window and a wide turn radius. He hasn't accounted for a platform built to circle low and slow." It was, in its way, the clearest articulation yet of everything that had made her an outsider in the squadron and everything that now made her indispensable. The A-10 wasn't a relic tolerated despite its limitations. In this specific, patient, terrain-bound war, it was precisely the tool the enemy hadn't planned for. Command authorized a new posture. Cross en route would fly extended patrol patterns over Sector 9 Delta during the predicted window of the next attack, trading the traditional model of reactive scramble for something closer to persistent presence. Hours of low, slow circling engines droning over the valley like a held threat, visible enough that word would travel through the local population, through whatever networks fed the shepherd his intelligence, that the sky over that valley now belonged to something patient and watchful. It was unglamorous work. It meant hours of fuel-conscious circling, monotonous radio checks, eyes straining against heat shimmer and dust for any sign of movement. Cross didn't mind. She had never needed glamour. She had needed for 11 years exactly this, the chance to be present, low and slow and unmistakably there before the 4 minutes that mattered ran out. Root, flying beside her through the long, patient hours, began to understand something about his flight lead he hadn't grasped before. This wasn't a woman trying to prove herself. This was a woman who had already decided, long before anyone doubted her, exactly what kind of pilot she intended to be.